quick snack. As Sabrina said, we do have monthly events. Part of those are a webinar, part of those are roundtables at Cafe over in Bellevue. Some of those are formal events like this with speakers. Our last one was at Starbucks HQ in downtown. Had about 24 people show up for that. Prior to that, we were at Costco headquarters in, must have been late May, talking about the architecture frameworks that are out there, Zacumen, EAQ, TOGAF, etc. So every month is a different topic. We're always looking for new speakers, new contributors. So if you yourself have a topic you'd like to talk about, if you have a more formal agenda, let us know and we can discuss an abstract as for a formal event like today. If you prefer just to have a more roundtable-ish kind of conversation on business value, any architecture topics of interest to you, we're more than happy to have you sit down with us and consider being a facilitator for the roundtables as well. So without further ado, thank you for your time and your attendance this evening, and turn it over to Wayne.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
So, Wayne Anderson, I'm an infrastructure managed services solution architect for Avanade. My primary responsibility is leading managed service architecture for our Midwest region, which includes Chicago, Minneapolis, and Wisconsin, and all those sorts of areas. One of the other roles that I serve here in North America is as one of our infrastructure as a service subject matter experts. And there's a lot of customers that I've dealt with. I actually looked at my customer portfolio from the last 3 years, and I stopped counting at 45. In the past year, I've worked with 19 customers. 10 of them are in the Fortune 500. Many of the things that we're going to talk about here today are actually challenges that are common to many of these customers. So before we get started, there's a few things I just want to cover about Avanade. We've been around since 2000. We're really a provider of business technology solutions as well as managed services with a uniquely deep focus on the Microsoft platform. And we leverage the relationship of our parents, Accenture and Avanade, to deliver results for our customers. What we're seeing right now in the marketplace, of course, is that the huge advantages that we're seeing in technology, in the data, the way that people are using data, it's really changing how people work. So we've got to focus across devices, across people, across products that provide insight, as well as connected systems that help align the way that we work with our customers. Just a couple things. We are always looking for good architects. Here in the room, we've got a couple roles that are open, as well as a contact for one of our recruiters if that's something that you're interested in. One of the other things here in the room, you've got a person by the name of Bhargavi there in the back. Bar, can you wave your hand? Bar actually leads our technical training for Avanade. She also has been developing our IaaSA integration in Avanade. One of the focuses that we're looking at right now is continuing to bring bigger, broader, cross-vertical and also cross-technology focus to the way that we look at architecture. So with that, one of the common things we're looking at with our customers is this idea of IT becoming a services broker. Increasingly, there's a lot of alignment to business demand. There is a lot of interest in the types of economics, the type of features, the type of systems that IT can provide. Now, one of the interesting things here is that it erodes the role of IT leadership in some people's view. And as architects, we find ourselves at one of the major turning points of what architecture is in the industry, where it extends, how it works, who we talk to, ultimately who's involved in service decisions and service architecture itself. And so it raises a lot of questions. Questions that go from what's in the marketing and what's behind the marketing, all the way through to how do we work with vendor organizations, how does our organization or our customers, depending on whether you're an internal or external architect, how do we continue to work with them to help them continue not only this business trend, but also this rapid development of cloud technology. So we're going to cover a few things today. One of those things is we're going to take a look at some of the cloud marketing real quick, more or less just kind of setting the stage for where cloud is today, kind of where it's been. Engagement. this is one of the big things about cloud. How we talk to who we talk to. A lot of the steps of the process are slightly adapted, shall we say, for cloud. There are ways that we have to talk to people differently. There are ways that we look at things a little bit differently. But I think you're going to find that there's a lot that we're still doing in the same way as we did yesterday. Technology. Technology of the cloud, there are common problems I'm seeing across customers today. Big customers, little customers, all kinds of organizations. One of the unique things about working for Avanade, one of the unique things about working with so many different customers is seeing different industries, different viewpoints, working with customers through challenges as they get into the cloud. And I think that I personally find it amazing that some of the largest companies, the brand names that you regularly go into the grocery store and buy from, or call up and pay for your power, or use to move around the country, are struggling with some of the same cloud technology challenges and cloud integration challenges as the 2,000 person retail operation that just is running a handful of stores. We'll talk a little bit about future. And what do I mean by future? Right? I'm not a prognosticator. I'm not going to go out and tell you what's next in the world of cloud. But there are some clear evolutionary steps that are relevant for us as architects to get in front of. They present an opportunity for us to recognize and to continue to work with and keep in mind as we go into our next project, our next meeting, our next discussion. So starting with the marketing, back in 2005 was a very interesting time where for the first time this idea of paying for compute, paying for capacity really was becoming viable technically. VMware in particular was working on a lot of technology that would allow you to do capacity-based motion between hosts and all this other interesting stuff that really allowed people to go from here's a way of having a sales pitch to here's some technology. At the same time, there was an exceptional amount of kind of overexcitement, if you will, in the way that some of this technology was presented. IBM back then was selling a security service. Hey, it's easy, it's cost effective, you can get this security service, and requires minimal maintenance. In fact, they even say at the end here, just set it and forget it. Right? It sounds like a bad infomercial. Well, that same year, Amazon Web Services, that was debuting a lot of their first flight platforms of the AWS platform, they came out with a somewhat similar statement for SimpleDB, their SimpleDB product, which was more of a platform as a service offering. Very, very early example of platform as a service. But hey, it's easy to use. It's the core functionality of a database with lookup and querying without operational complexity. Well, depending on how you use it, that could be true. Maybe it's not. We move forward a few years. And as we continue to move forward a few years, we're seeing leaps and bounds in the technology behind the cloud. We're seeing leaps and bounds in the way that cloud is offered. We're seeing leaps and bounds in the way that our customers, our organizations, ourselves, are connecting service components, are connecting operational components to leverage the value that cloud offers. But in the marketing, in what your bosses and my bosses are seeing, they're still seeing some of the same things. Right? This whole idea, this is actually taken off of the Amazon Web Services webpage just the other day. Auto-scaling. You can automatically scale your fleet or maintain your fleet at a set size. It's well suited for your application, and it could be true. Maybe it's not, right? Somebody has to figure that out. Same thing when you look at the load balancing. You could achieve greater fault tolerance for applications, less manual intervention. Could be true. Compared to what? Somebody's got to make that determination. somebody has to work with that service, somebody has to help make that decision. And it's true for other services. Never wait for servers or infrastructure again. Okay, except when you have to wait to buy the infrastructure because you didn't set it up right. Right? There's a lot of stuff that has to happen for that to be true. The same thing when you look at even the newest offering, Azure Machine Learning. This amazing new way of making scalable access to machine learning possible for a wide variety of companies that could never ever set up their own Hadoop clusters and get all of the skills and infrastructure knowledge and all this other stuff to make something like this happen, is now a buy it by the byte kind of service. Well, that's great. Hey, drag, drop, and predict. It's that easy. If you know the R programming language, and if you generally understand the architecture, and if you already have the application built, it is that easy. But somebody has to figure out whether you're in a position to do all those steps and really drive home this claim. Maybe your organization can do it. Maybe it can't. Somebody has to be part of that process. One of the big things from my experience that I'll just share is the observation that cloud solves a lot of how. How you deal with fault tolerance, how you deal with high availability, how you deal with disaster recovery, how you deal with scale, how you deal with technologies that you may not be in a position to deploy in limited data centers that this organization or another organization has. Great answers for those problems, but it's in the how. There are other questions out there, like why? Why would I deploy that? Do I need SimpleDB? I don't know. Do I need machine learning? I don't know. What am I doing? Right? So somebody has to figure out that part. Which gets us to the engagement model, right? We as architects have a role somewhere in this process. There are a lot of different architects in the room. I have no idea what you do. Some of us probably lead software projects. Some of us probably lead infrastructure projects. Some of us probably organize and build the way that different business processes work together. All along the spectrum at different sized companies, there are different elements that those architects play in the cloud. And the cloud continues a lot of classical engagement features of the relationships that we would have with an organization and the activities that we would engage in on a project, but it also introduces some subtle changes in where some of our considerations are and how we look at some of the problems of grouping work and thinking about work and adjusting work, as well as some of the opportunities that we have to get more engaged with the business. So when you look at an enterprise architecture, and there are 50 million different ways of looking at enterprise architecture, or really ontologies, right? Ways of grouping individual taxonomies. It can get really, really complicated. So one of the first things I want to do is I want to be real clear. We're going to stay at a very high level with this. We're going to step back a little bit, right? Typically, I see some of the same categories of challenges that customers have when they first start to deal with cloud. One of those things is, of course, the business. There's business problems. There's a reason that they're looking at the cloud in the first place. Defining, understanding, grasping what that is. Second one is capability. Do I have skills? Do I have people? Do I have enough people? Can I get enough people? What happens if I put another application in the cloud? Will I have people then? Do my people have skills that translate to this new cloud platform? There's a lot of stuff that's in that capability box. Same thing with systems. The systems, the technology itself has to be obtained, has to be used, has to be integrated. There's work that has to be done to make use of it. Very seldom do you come across an application where you just lay down your credit card and tomorrow you're ready to go. Normally, at bare minimum, somebody has to connect it to something or put some data in there, or they have to configure the application. Hey, let's create some users, right? Some sort of work has to happen in the technology space for cloud to be possible. And then the other thing is the process. Some of those are maintenance processes, some of those are deployment processes, some of those are business processes. But process has to be wrapped around the things that cloud is deployed. Remember that cloud was how. Here's the thing. Cloud is not business aware, right? The cloud exists, it doesn't know about your capability typically. It knows something about your systems. Your processes, it fits in. It doesn't necessarily know how you work, doesn't know how you're going to work tomorrow, has no idea how you worked last week. And then the final thing is, cloud knows nothing about your business. And that's the most critical piece. When you go out and you buy a cloud platform, it doesn't know what your business units are. It is business agnostic typically. Now it's customized for businesses. It's customized for specific use cases. It's integrated with things that could be business aware, like line of business applications. But it's important to realize that the people in this room, the architects, are what brings the context of these different elements to cloud. And that doesn't sound so revolutionary. It's the same thing we were doing for technology systems last week. Same thing we were doing for systems last year. Same thing we were doing for businesses 5 years ago. It's important to start with that basis. Cloud solves the how. It doesn't solve the why. It doesn't solve the what. It doesn't solve the for who. We have to bring those elements to a cloud project for that cloud project to continue to have elements that set it up for success. The other thing is, the cloud is a very interesting thing in that a lot of the early adoption kind of left this whole idea of metrics out of the equation. And it is very challenging once you get any sort of deployment, and cloud is no different, to go back and try and add instrumentation after the fact that allows you to find out how your systems relate to your operations, how your operations relate to your business, how your systems relate to your business, right? Forming all of these data relationships after the fact can be a very expensive and complicated project, very, very difficult to do. So understanding up front, having some way to measure, do I have the right capability for the systems that I deploy? Do I have the right capability for my business? All of those things that we've ever done in a traditional software or infrastructure or business project, they still apply when a cloud service exists. Even if it's something like software as a service where you've bought into a pricing model where someone else is taking care of the infrastructure, someone else is taking care of how the software actually runs day to day, we still have to understand whether the capability is there and can be used and can be applied effectively to solve whatever the business problem is. So when you look at a project itself, and what I've tried to do is there are so many different ways of structuring a project. I've taken a very generalized view of the software development lifecycle to define the steps that I use here. Your involvement with cloud typically does not start in the prioritization process. Prioritization, need identification, doing your portfolio analysis, getting the business context, all of those initial activities are activities that are about the business. It's not about the cloud, right? Those are the things that are the drivers that help you figure out the what and the who and the why that get you to how. The how comes in very quickly thereafter, but you have to ask those questions and get the semblance of the first steps of those answers before you get to the how, before the cloud comes into play. Cloud starts here. Cloud starts with planning and analysis. That's where you come in and you say, you know what, we have strategic goals. And part of those strategic goals could be things like, it's time to get capital off the books. It could be, hey, we've got a platform that's already partially deployed to XYZ vendor, and we need to maintain parity with skills that we already have, minimize investments in new skills. Well, gosh, we already have this vendor, let's continue to look at that vendor. It's in the requirements analysis, it's in the design specification, where you're starting to bring the high-level conceptual view of how the business is going to operate, how the systems play into that, how the capability gets developed around it, and kind of the initial cut of the business case, right? Somewhere in here, you have a pretty good idea of what you're going to in the cloud. And the people here, again, are the ones who are driving those discussions. Those are responsibilities that we have as architects. Amazon can't do this for me. Microsoft can sort of do it for me, right? They have Microsoft consulting services. But I'm still the expert on my business. You're still the expert on your business. And that kind of expertise is critical to whether we end up with a great technology platform that solves nothing, or whether we have something that has good alignment to the business unit. The design, development, and build process, by the time that you get to this point, typically you're going to be very far along in the identification of relevant cloud vendors, products, integrated workloads. But before we get there, there's one thing that I want to just emphasize. This is an anti-practice that I see a lot of customers doing. And I just want to put it out there, if for nothing else but discussion. Beware vendor-based requirements. Saying, I have stuff on Amazon Web Services, therefore using Amazon Web Service is a requirement, is very poor practice. What the true issue that underlies a statement like that is, maybe I have skills that I've already developed on Amazon Web Services. Maybe I have data that's already in Amazon Web Services. So the real requirement there is that I need to have fast access to my existing stores of information. I need to have minimal investment in new skills, and that's going to drive me to stay with a platform that maybe I'm already on. Now, why does that matter, right? Can't I just take the shorthand of, well, I'm already on AWS, so I should be on AWS, or I'm already on Azure, so I should stay on Azure? Well, the problem comes later on, when you're doing evaluation of whatever you've deployed, or when you're looking at continuous improvement, or let's say that you decide to change providers. You no longer have traceability or ability to reference what your original requirements were that drove you to make a design decision, because all you've got in that place is a shorthand. You don't have the things that were behind that decision. You don't have the things that were behind the selection of an individual platform or an individual technology, because you kind of took the shortcut that said, well, I've got stuff there, I'm just going to go there. Once you've got your build, of course, that gets you to actually doing the implementation and all the technical wrench pulling and turning and everything that happens, whether that's working with end users in the business, and saying, hey, here's how things are going to work tomorrow. We're changing the address, or things are going to look a little different, or maybe it'll work a little bit different. Or it could be some serious heavy lifting of developers and infrastructure experts actually putting things in place. And it gets you to support in operations. So I'm going to make a controversial statement that by the time that you get to support operations and then the evaluation cycle, cloud actually generally stops right before support and operations. But I'm going to qualify that. I'm going to say ish. Cloud stops here-ish. And what I mean by that is that depending on the way that you're using cloud services, depending on what you've bought, who you've bought it from, different types of cloud services have different extensions into the operational arena. Some cloud services are a highly intelligent platform that we control the implementation, aggregation, construction, engineering, long-term operations of. Some cloud services have high-level support teams that truly can be integrated in the way that we as an organization provide service day-to-day to our customers, whether that's end users, whether that's some sort of third party. So it's important to remember that just like cloud really didn't extend into the first steps of the process, by the time that you get to support and operations, that's where we get back that complete ownership again, right? There are parts in between where some of the technology platform could be owned by the cloud provider. Now, it's up to us how we arrange it, how we fit it in, what fits into the cloud, what it integrates with, how it works, whether it's the right fit in the first place. But within those steps, once we've delegated something to a cloud service, there are cloud engineering teams and roadmaps and typically commercial agreements that we're accepting that define the bounds of some element of service that we're now working around and plugging into. So I want to be very clear. The steps from the initial cloud boundary, right, in the plan and analyze, to the second cloud boundary that we have just after implementation, we don't abdicate our responsibilities in those processes. We are still consuming cloud services, but we're integrating it with something. We own the overall project, we own the way that it's architected, and we own the way that it integrates and ultimately solves a business problem. Once we get into support and operations, and then evaluation of the deployed platform, that's where we have complete responsibility again for the way that the organization continues to work with the cloud vendor, how we look at the deployed cloud applications or elements, if you will, and how we integrate them for long-term support. One of the common places that I see customers unfortunately stumble into is actually in this operations arena. We're going to spend a little bit more time there. So, I think it's also important to look at barriers to the cloud. And Accenture Research did a survey and report in 2013, and these are the key barriers to the cloud that really were showing where customers were having challenges making cloud purchases. One of the big ones is data security and privacy. Figuring out how I handle PII, figuring out how I work with identities, figuring out how I work with access management, figuring out what my commercial agreements are that govern those processes. Legacy applications, we all have them. But particularly in government, health, retail, some sorts of financial services, as well as utilities, they happen to be a very strong area of the environment. Another thing is regulatory compliance. For certain types of regulatory compliance, it can be very difficult to understand how a cloud provider fits into the regulatory structure, what kind of responsibilities they have to take on, and to figure out what an adequate commercial agreement was with that sort of cloud provider. That can be one of the toughest things to figure out in contracting, because obviously as a consumer of a cloud service, I want them to sign up to support me in the way that I need to be supported, but at the same time, it's not really in their interest to take on liabilities that relate to my compliance. So that is an area of turbulence that we see all the time. Conservative IT adoption, this cloud thing is new, and it represents risk, and it represents change. And we're comfortable letting other people cut themselves on those bleeding edge projects. That is a mindset in some industries, in some companies, in some IT units, in some managers. And it does have an effect on cloud purchasing. The other thing is unknown reliability. It's great if I have a piece of paper that says somebody's going to give me a certain number of nines of availability. But what really does that mean? When your platform falls down, Mr. Cloud Provider, are you going to somehow help me get back that revenue that I just lost because I was down for 3 days? Probably not. Most service credits and so forth that you get as part of a cloud provider, you're not going to make up for those faults. And that can be a big issue financially for customers that are looking at putting important systems on cloud providers. They say, well, gosh, what if it falls down? I want to draw something out. The reason I put these up here is a lot of these things are things that we as architects have an opportunity to work with our organization or our customer, depending on our architectural context, to help them work through. Help figure out how legacy applications relate to new cloud services. To figure out what an identity map could look like. Does the business value of a new system provide enough value to the organization that it's worth making the investments that get us past security problems? There are ways out there. There are applications out there. It's all solvable at a cost. We have to figure out whether that cost is worth it. Some organizations it might not be yet. But there's a cost to that decision as well. Yep.
I don't see the unknown reliability as one of these barriers, because any other solution aside from the cloud will have to have an unknown reliability. You cannot have a solution that you cannot guarantee like the system will fail at some point.
Well,
sometime.
Perception is reality, right?
Right.
So Office 365, very reliable solution. But there was a time when it was first stood up where Microsoft suffered several outages. And they were very large-scale events, very unpredictable events that would be challenging for any organization, even someone of Microsoft's size, to control, given the level of complexity that it takes to do true multi-tenancy. But for a while in the marketplace, you would go in and you talk with a customer about whether Office 365 was a fit for their organization. And IT managers, you know, people who are very senior in the purchasing decision, who saw jobs and so on being threatened by this new development, would crack these jokes about Office 361, right? And once the laughter in the room kind of subsided, the reality was that that problem that they're looking at was kind of a one-off event. But guess what? If my email's in Office 365, and I don't have a way to fail over and I can't get my email for a few hours, that's going to leave a scar tissue in my brain about that massacre day that none of my people could get to email and I had no workaround. About the day that the CEO himself called my desk phone and said, where is my email and when am I getting it back? And I couldn't give him an answer, right? The reality is that some people see those events, some people have those experiences, and whether it's true that that is indicative of future performance, which it generally isn't, right? Just having that scar tissue in the industry actually can be an inhibitor. Google Apps had the same experience. In fact, just the other day, DreamHost, a relatively commodity hosting provider, had just a complete freak accident in their traditional hosting model where one of their power components completely went offline. And it was one of the few components that did not have a backup. It was a physical conduit, right? How is a copper wire going to fail? Well, it did. Stuff like that happens. And people see things like that, and they say, well, what happens if that happens again next month, next year? We can architect around problems like that to a certain degree, but it actually gets into something that I'll talk about here in just a few minutes. So let's talk about technology. And I'm lying a little bit. We're not just going to talk about technology, but it's about how the technology of the cloud relates to some of those other pieces that we looked at, right? That systems piece down in the corner has a heavy relationship with operations. It has a heavy relationship with business, has a heavy relationship with capability. And we have to understand how those relationships work, how to manage those relationships, how to structure those relationships to be successful with cloud deployments. Those, again, are responsibilities that we as architects have. So security has to be something that is integrated into the platform from the start. Security is one of the biggest inhibitors in survey after survey, analyst after analyst, talking to customers, talking to CIOs. Security is coming up every single time. It is a challenge that I solve for every single customer that makes the move to the cloud, because every single customer has to figure out the answer to that question, right? How do I keep my data secure? How do I deal with identity in the cloud? How do I deal with introducing new vendors? How do I deal with the additional operational processes, et cetera, that could be leaking points for my data? And when you look at kind of the three-step maturity model, and this is a very simple maturity model for how you look at cloud adoption, going from the early adoption standpoint, well, we're going to look at cloud for this project over here, maybe it fits for this component, to widespread use. Widespread use is where cloud technologies are integrated into the service landscape. Well, generally, business unit alignment to that cloud strategy is kind of inconsistent. Maybe there's not a lot of integration into a service catalog yet. And then you get to kind of a more mature state where you really have operational integration of any cloud services. There are clear standards for how things get aligned to business commitments. And we started out with this picture of IT as a services broker. Part of getting to the most mature state is having clear alignment between what you're acquiring from a cloud service and what you're providing back to the business. It's not a straight pass-through. There is an important ability to add value for IT now and into the future in how cloud services are combined, how they're integrated with other developments, other knowledge that we have natively about our businesses. But making the jumps between these steps involves handling some of these barriers. And security actually can be a barrier. Even once you make the initial decision to get into early adoption, wholesale security, solving more of the security question, having more security context becomes a gate to get into widespread use, to deploy it more, to harvest that and to go and do another project with it. It becomes a gate again to integrate it into your process. How do I deal with identity across multiple vendors? Do I have the right policies? How do I deal, how do I specify how my regulatory compliance flows through to these other vendors? It's a gate again, getting to that last step of maturity. You can't manage what you can't monitor. One of the places I see a lot of my customer architects fall down is that they've done some of that early stage, early adoption. And they had some sort of monitoring product that sat on servers. And it sat on their storage area network, and it sat on some Cisco switches. And back in the old world, Bob could get a little ring on his pager at 4 in the morning because a Cisco switch went down. And so he had the chance to very quickly respond to that, and that's how everything was integrated into their organizational process. Well, guess what? In the cloud, your ability, your visibility into the health of the service has to be put there by somebody. It has to be designed there by somebody, and that somebody is you. You have to figure out how you make use of the health statistics, the health services that are either made available as part of the service or extended into the service by us as architects. If you can't get that health information, if you do not have that instrumentation, it's going to be very difficult to effectively own a service end to end. And I would even argue, when you look at some of the higher value services, right? One of the things when I talk about this that people ask me is, well, what about software as a service? I have essentially a set of commitments that tell me it's going to run all the time, and it's going to run all the time in the way that I want it to do, and I'll be able to do everything, and unicorns will dance with daisies and everything else. Well, the reality is, somewhere in the organization, at either a business level or an IT level, we as architects should be pushing for the commercial commitments that allow that kind of service to have commitments and visibility to us in the way that we need to. Not all monitoring is technological. Some of the monitoring is process-oriented. Hey, I need to have a notification if my CRM system that I bought as a service is encountering challenges. The way that I get warning of that should not be when I have 300,000 users calling me to tell me my CRM is down. The way that I get notification that I've had an availability challenge for the last 6 months should be a proactive step of governance that I have set up between myself and my service provider. Now, depending on the value of the service, depending on the scope of the service, the commitments that you can get back from a cloud provider vary, but certainly it should be something that you have a strategy on. That is a combination of technical features where it's possible, especially in platform as a service and definitely in infrastructure as a service. But the operational pieces, what are you doing from a governance perspective? What are you doing from a process perspective? How are you dealing with change? And then finally, at a contractual perspective. Ultimately, the commitments that you have back from your cloud provider should reflect the commitments that you make to the business. And it's on us as architects to make sure that there's that back-to-back alignment and traceability. One of the other corollaries here, you can't remediate what you can't test. Testing in a very similar way is a challenge in the cloud, especially as the complexity lever goes up. And just like when network load balancing kind of came into vogue, and you had these network load balancers that were sometime load balancers. And you know, somebody would get on an application, they'd call into the help desk and they'd say, I can't get my data. And the next guy, you know, you go and test it, and that IT guy would say, well, I'm getting perfectly fine behavior. And it would take a long time to figure out why this variability and end user experience was happening. Same thing applies to the cloud. As you get more and more abstracted away from the solution, as you're adding things like autoscalers and adding the ability to do all kinds of weird adjustment of resources, and you're getting into platform as a service, a lot of that information gets more and more difficult to test because you've got more and more scenarios, more and more logic paths that you can follow in the application, in the infrastructure, in the system, in the business. So it's important that it's not just about monitoring, it's also about the ability to test during the process of implementation. One of the things that is very interesting is that a lot of the work that we do with the benefits that cloud provides, things like high availability, disaster recovery, it's all done at the workload level. So you start with this platform. Hey, I'm doing this thing that fulfills a business function that I'm architecting in a certain way with business processes and all that sort of stuff at a very high level. That gets kind of broken down into what I'm calling here applications. Within a given application, it could be an application within the business context. You know, here's how I'm applying the higher level architecture of what I'm trying to do from a business perspective. It could be a technology application. Hey, as part of this platform, I need to run a web front end that provides a publishing portal. You know, and that's one of the applications that I have in my platform. Well, below that, there is actually a workload of serving that content. Below that, there could be a workload of how I deal with individual users, how I notify individual users. There could be a business workload of how somebody goes through a process to approve some new piece of content that has to get approved. Now, that may also get implemented in the technology, but there's a business process there too that has to be looked at in the same way that we did last year. But the how also gets looked at the workload level to say, what are we leveraging from the cloud provider that lets us do this better, cheaper, more efficiently? A lot of the things that cloud does happen in this last layer, this workload layer, where stuff is broken down, not necessarily to an atomic component, but to individual groups of related components. A lot of the architecture that we do at the platform level, even at the application level, I would argue in some cases, just depends on the cloud platform, those first couple levels, what we have as architects, the responsibility that we have as architects, are largely unaffected from the way that we were doing business 5 years ago. Cloud economics. It's very, very hard to realize cloud savings if your application, if your system, if your business is not leveraging cloud behaviors. When you think about the reasons that people get into cloud, it's about shifting operational cost, it's about scalability, it's about consumption, it's about unitary pricing. But if the things that consume that cloud service can't consume a business or cannot consume a service in the same way that its price and that price advantage is leveraged, you're going to have a challenge ever realizing your business case from the cloud. And unfortunately, I've seen customers that have lost money, have spent more money because they went to the cloud. Why? Because they took an unoptimized workload and they said, I'm just going to turn around, I'm going to lift it, and I'm going to shift it, and I'm going to operate it in the same way in the cloud as I did on physical servers that I own in cheap data centers that I staff minimally and provide bare operational support. I got much better service in the cloud, but because I didn't translate that workload to take advantage of cloud capabilities, I spent more money. Great examples of that are management efficiencies. Guess what? When everything's in the cloud, I don't necessarily have to be next to the server to press the power button, right? There's consolidation that I can look at there. There are ways of bringing functions and skill sets and capabilities together that as a business, I can look at to realize savings. Some organizations miss that step. Same thing with consumption-based provisioning. One of the biggest money losers that I see customers go into, believe it or not, is development environments. A lot of customers use infrastructure as a service for a development environment, and then they don't turn them off. And every hour that it's running, that a developer is not looking at that environment, or is not referencing that environment, or is not pulling data from that environment, is just money that's going out the door. And so there are operational and technical options for how that problem gets addressed. In some cases, it's an easy fix. But just because something's obvious doesn't mean it's not a problem, right? Sometimes we overlook the obvious because we spend so much time on the complex. Platform cost optimization. This is about procurement. It's about moving beyond that first foray into the cloud. That first foray into the cloud, well, different companies will look at that acquisition in different ways, but one of the things that I see a lot is customers move into private cloud or they move into public cloud infrastructure as a service as a first step, because it provides that careful balance between control. I have control over my processes, I have control over, at least more control over the way that my data is used and propagated and associated and indexed and all the other things. But as you continue up the value chain in cloud services, there is continuing opportunity to take more and more money off the table by centralizing functions into high-scale services that typically should offer better economic advantage. For example, if you're buying into equal capability, the same capability platform as a service should be more economical than the same capability provided through some mass of infrastructure as a service. Same thing when you look at software as a service. Software as a service should offer better value to an organization as long as it's apples to apples comparison than component parts of a customer doing it themselves. There are always exceptions to every rule. Sometimes I see that not work out because potentially environments are under-provisioned, or they're under-resourced, or they're targeting a different service level, and this service over here is targeting a higher one, right? But it is something to pay attention to. As you mature in the process, you should see money coming out of the process. One of the last things I want to touch on is capacity management and business continuity. As architects, we have responsibilities to be able to answer questions at a level higher than the cloud. We need to be very careful that we don't get locked into the cloud mindset. If somebody comes to me and says, what happens when the cloud fails? And I'm answering in some sort of context of what happens within that cloud provider, I'm in a world of trouble. A lot of customers haven't had those conversations, even large ones. They're looking at acquiring a single vendor, and there should at least be a conversation that says, does the system or workload or environment that I'm doing cloud integration with, does it make sense for me to step back and say, what's my other path? What happens if? Is there business value to having a backup plan? It could be that it would be so expensive, it's just not perfect. But the question should be asked and answered. And then the other thing is, capacity spikes. This is one of the big things that drives people doing cloud adoption. Hey, you have this auto provisioning capability. Are you using it? A lot of customers I see make their initial transition. It really is that lift and shift scenario. I'm going to use this new set of cloud services in the same way that I use the old services that were running on my hardware. And they don't answer this question until 2 or 3 different iterations of the platform later. By asking this question up front, how are we making use of those cloud features? We can solve some of our capacity and provisioning and disaster recovery problems before they become problems, by architecting and designing it into the platform in the first place. Yep.
So to start a great presentation, thank you so much for all the information. I have a question regarding all this. How does IT service management play a role in all of this?
Sure. It's funny that you asked that. I saw a great ad, actually in the airport on my way to come to Seattle. And it was an ad from ServiceNow, and it said, go from the Department of No to the Department of Now. And I was really thinking about that. And it's a great tagline. First of all, it's memorable, obviously. But it's also a really relevant place to advertise for where the state of the IT industry is. A lot of customers, and I will say I see very strong variability with this. I can't come to you and say that customers above 30,000 users typically have good service management, right? My experience has actually been one of the biggest customers I've ever worked with is one of the worst processes I've ever seen. And I've seen 2,000 user environments that are extremely strongly regulated, that have strong governance, because they had a CIO or a CTO early in the process that said, wait. Before we get too far down the road, let's get our feet under ourselves, let's do something a little different, let's spend some money, and the board of directors said, let's go do it. IT service management has a very strong relationship, and a strong relationship both to the positive realization of cloud savings, as well as a realization of challenge. One of the things I like to tell customers, and I was in front of a retail CIO not too long ago where I told him this, is that the adoption of cloud services often forces internal maturity. And that sounds counterintuitive. Gosh, why, aren't I buying someone else to have that maturity for me? Well, sort of, maybe. Depends on why you're buying cloud and what you're buying. But internally, you have to have some way to align what you're buying from a cloud service with what you actually need from an application and platform and operational perspective. How do I know that 99-point-something% availability is enough? Once I get it into operation, am I getting it? Am I offering it? Am I meeting my internal promises to my business units? Maybe I am, maybe I'm not, right? But it's my service management process, my service management catalog that has a very big role in identifying how those workloads get to an application, get to a platform, they get to a business relationship, they get offered to a customer, and how I'm meeting that customer need, right? Traceability is still key. Have I met my constraints? Well, hopefully. Have I met my requirements? Well, I darn sure hope so, because if I'm not, right, there's no use in me having a cloud platform in the first place. But that gets expressed as a service catalog, and it gets operated daily as two things, a set of service management process, as well as a comparison against the commitments that are in that catalog, aligned to individual services. Does that help?
Yes, totally. Great, thank you.
Which gets us to the future. A couple things. So there is a very, very strong business drive for CIO and IT alignment to business-driven priorities. This is emerging in a trend of shadow IT. It's also emerging in a trend of budget moves. It's also emerging in a trend of reporting relationships. Something on the order of 40% of CIOs report to roles other than the CEO right now. They report to CFOs. Sometimes they report to other roles, COOs. And often that reporting relationship can actually be a kind of a little window into where the priorities of that company are. It's something that I see quite a lot given the number of customers that I work with in a typical year. One of the other things is, back in 2010, as early as 2010, Gartner actually recognized this shift 4 years ago and wrote a document expressly on this. Best practices to proactively engage the business in data management planning. Right? Customers, and whether that's your internal customer or some other organization, they're seeing consumer technology, right? Consumerization of IT has been around for years. But they're also seeing capabilities that other vendors have in the marketplace. They're seeing capabilities that other businesses have. They're seeing innovations that are in news articles, and they want that. They have ideas. Ideas are no longer about the solution group that sits over in this little cube farm over here, and all ideas that are blessed by the company must come out of this cube farm, right? We're seeing innovation become more of a company trend. And when you have that, you're seeing investments that comes out of individual business units rather than just that solutions group. It's not as clean. You have to plan for that shift. You have to get in front of that shift. And for us as architects, it's actually an opportunity. We develop business relationships early. We have the opportunity to engage the business, to learn more about it, to learn about how it functions, to align ourselves to it. That's how we get in front of it today. Big data. Big data is today. Analytics is today. I see a lot of people still discussing it as future. It's not. It's today. Yesterday it was future. Today it's today. There are a couple things to keep in mind though. Internet of Things is still kind of stumbling along. That is, I would say it's a mix. Some industries, believe it or not, have very strong introduction of Internet of Things. Caterpillar. Did you know that every Caterpillar tractor that's sold in certain lines right now has a little puck about this big that sits on top of that tractor? And what that little white puck is actually a GPS positioning disc. And so the construction industry, believe it or not, has hundreds of thousands of these tractors running around with GPS markers that say, here I am, here's what kind of tractor I am, and what business I'm registered to. And that information is being analyzed and being fed into machine learning, and it's being fed into engineering algorithms. An industry that we look at as having relatively simple mechanics is anything but. There are entire multi-billion-dollar companies that do nothing but put out products related to all of this information business in construction. That's an incredible opportunity. It's big data in an area that we probably don't think of very much. It's Internet of Things today in the industry being used in a very useful, commercially viable way. Do I think that every light bulb in here should have an IP address? I don't know. I don't know what you're going to do with that data. I'm not sure where that's going to go. And that's going to lead to another trend. the pendulum swing. Anybody who's been in IT has seen this trend where we get involved in a certain model and then we swing away from it for a while, right? And it's kind of a macro thing. It's not really true for all companies, but I do believe that we're going to reach a point where you're going to go kind of through the Gartner hype cycle. You're going to get to just the ridiculous expectations of big data, and then you're going to get into this trough of disillusionment, where the pendulum is going to swing the other way, and you're going to say, do we really need all this data, right? And so there's going to be a trend of recognizing what's useful, and that's what's retained and stored and analyzed. The trick is figuring out the logic to figure out what's useful and what's not.
It's really an experiment right now.
Yeah.
People really don't know where it's going, and you can say the same of technology,
Mm-hmm.
or any new technology. It's a matter of figuring out where it fits.
Yeah.
Just because you can do it doesn't mean you should.
That's right. Yeah. I'm sure I can get an IP address on my lamp right now. I'm not sure why. Right? And I think that we've got a lot of technologies that are out there right now where we're going through that process. Well, great. I'm glad I can do it. Why again am I paying you extra money to be able to do that?
Well, think about back to a time when there wasn't e-commerce.
Yeah.
Okay? And everyone was speculating as to how consumers were going to use e-commerce
Yeah.
to purchase. And they were right in some ways and we were wrong in others, you know.
Yep. Absolutely.
So it's the same sort of thing, just, I think right now, I think what I've seen, organizations are almost paralyzed, but they're choking on the data that's coming through.
Absolutely.
And it costs them a whole lot of money to have it.
Well, and I think it's funny because some of the best sources of experience that have been dealing with a lot of these complex problems for a long time actually have, I would say, moderate ability to share their experience with the industry because it's competitive advantage. It's things like search engines. Google's been dealing with this problem for a decade or more. There's a lot that we could leverage from that, and we're seeing one-off webcasts, we're seeing one-off contributions back, but we're really not seeing a lot of those contributions make it into the marketplace unless you go out and you hire a Google engineer. That's what people are doing. They're hiring people who have experience at Google, at Facebook, and everything else, and it's an extremely expensive way to integrate that knowledge. One of the other things is cognitive computing. One of the things that I am very passionate about right now is the future of the Oculus. I can envision a tomorrow where a couple of camera points and this thing on my face can allow me to look up, point at something on a screen. I can move my fingers in front of myself. It will read where my fingers were and put text in this window that exists only in my face. You can't steal my data because it's in my face. I've got 6 screens. You can't see 6 screens. Again, it's in my face. There are so many things that I see that technology being able to do into the future, tracking my movements, virtual haptic interaction. There's a lot of crazy things that are going on that when you connect them with big data, it's new experiences. It's new ways of visualizing data. And it's not just about that kind of visualization of data. It's also about how you query data in the first place. Siri is a great example of that. Siri is an interface to a massive world of data. And it's data that's defined by applications, it's data that's defined by pre-configured platforms, but it doesn't have to be. Right? At what point does natural language become artificial intelligence? Depends on the data set.
Doesn't that also alter the landscape of what we call search technology today, because of the fact that Siri, using Siri, you brought a great point here. So you have mobile devices, that's another paradigm shift that's happening today. So mobile computing, and then you have applications like Siri. I don't have to depend, I don't even know Google search engine anymore. You can use Bing, you can use anything to get information. So doesn't that also alter how companies like Google and other guys, Yahoos, do their business now?
Well, sort of, right? I could make the same argument using email. Doesn't the advent of Office 365 make every email server that's ever existed